this computer. All right. Sorry, Instagram, we're now live. So we're going to go over some endurance athlete myths and misconceptions and what the truth is behind the matter. So we, especially being in Flagstaff, we love endurance athletes. We participate in a lot of endurance sports ourselves, but we just see a lot of narratives in endurance sports that aren't really backed by science and can hurt not only how people perform, but their overall health as well. And so we want to get to the bottom of some of these. And if you've done any of our stuff, some of this might not be new, but we're hopefully going to present some really exciting and new tips and guidelines as we go along. So questions are welcome. I have a few myths and misconceptions that we're going to go through. Abby is on the line from our house with our other coaches, Coach Moch and Coach Kona. And so they are going to jump in from time to time as well. If you are on Instagram to see the slides, we can't share slides via Instagram. I don't think you'll need them to get a lot of what's going on. So if you're not in a place where you can join a Zoom, that's totally cool. But if you can join a Zoom, just click the link in our bio, online classes and webinars, and there's a link to just join the Zoom meeting. So feel free to do that. Without further ado, let's get going. So I'm Dr. Brian Kinslow. I'm a doctor of physical therapy. My partner in crime is Abby Chan, who's a registered dietitian and yoga teacher. And so we own Evolve Flagstaff, and we do a lot of things, but among those things is work with endurance athletes, both here in Flagstaff and around the country. So the first thing to know before we get into any myths or misconceptions is that endurance performance and endurance injuries are multifactorial, meaning there's a lot of different things that contribute to them. So there's just a couple of things on the screen here, but nutrition, strength, your aerobic endurance base, how you move and your technique in your sport, race conditions, mobility, genetics, lifestyle, like your sleep and your stress, and maybe your alcohol or intake of other substances. In professional sports, often, banned substances, all of those can add to your performance or detract from it. And so we're going to approach any of these conversations with a healthy dose of nuance. And the answer is probably always, it depends. There's very few hard and fast rules, but there's some pretty strong guidelines that we want to follow. But just know that almost everything is multifactorial when it comes to endurance sports. And that's really performance and health in general, but it's certainly true for endurance sports. So our first one, fact or fiction. So one thing we hear a lot is that cross-training with a different endurance sport is a good way to reduce injury risk. So let's say I'm a runner, I'm gonna mountain bike to reduce injury risk, or I'm a triathlete. This one is one I hear a lot. I'm a triathlete, and so my injury risk is inherently lower than a runner because I do 3 different domains. So what do we think, fact or fiction?
Fiction.
That one's fiction. Coach Moch agrees. So it's fiction because most of the cross training, at least when framed in this way, uses similar muscle groups. So running, biking, hiking, and swimming actually as well have actually similar muscle activation patterns where often the quadriceps can get overused and they pull us forward, meaning we tend to round through the thoracic spine. And so they also highly use the calf, even swimming, cycling, and running, there's all high calf activation. So if you're a triathlete, there's actually, I wouldn't say increased injury risk, but there's certain things that you have to be aware of because anybody who's been a triathlete before will know that their run feels a whole lot different after a swim and a bike than it does just running. And so know that there's similar activation patterns. There might be a little bit of benefit from a light, easy session of a different activity, but just doing another endurance sport in place of your primary sport doesn't guarantee injury prevention benefits. Also, none of these sports improve bone density or how tendons function. And so some of the more serious overuse injuries that we see, primarily in our runners or triathletes, are bone stress injuries or stress fractures and tendon injuries. And so to improve bone density, we need to add load to the system. Running is not necessarily enough, and swimming and biking don't have really a lot of impact load. So we want to do something if we're going to cross train or do something for injury prevention benefits to improve upon those things. So injuries tend to stem from improper training load and progression, our movement patterns, our muscle strength. But really, a lot of times it's not enough rest days. And so if you feel like you need to cross train, you might just need a rest day. Or let's cross-train a different way, which you're going to come away from this presentation knowing my bias, and that should be strength training rather than another endurance activity. Cool. So that's cross-training. So again, when we use that term, it's okay to do stuff different, but don't just go hard on another endurance sport. And just a reminder, sorry for people on the Zoom, but anybody on Instagram, we are doing this on Zoom with some slides. Click the link in our bio and you can join over there if you're interested. Okay, fact or fiction number 2, also on Instagram or Zoom, you can put in questions either in the comment box or just shout them out at any point. But stretching, massage and foam rolling, or core exercises, those 4 things: stretching, massage, foam rolling, core, are the keys to injury prevention and performance. Fact or fiction?
Fiction.
We got 1 vote for fiction, and that's going to be fiction again. So this is maybe number 2 of what I hear after some cross training when I hear endurance athletes talking about what they should do to stay healthy. They say I should stretch more, I should do more yoga, I really need to get a massage, or I just feel really tight, or I just need to do more core. And that's typically, they say in that broad way, more core. Why that's fiction, we're going to work through these one at a time. So we're going to hit stretching first. But with all of these, we may need, again, there's nuance, we may need adequate mobility and strength, but you're going to get to a point where you're probably going to see diminishing returns from that work. So what do I mean by that? So for flexibility and mobility, we need adequate mobility at each joint to move through your sport's range of motion. If you don't have it, then you might get an injury because you're going to bump into the end range of that joint every time. So what I mean is that the hip has to move behind us to be able to run. Typically 15 or 20 degrees. If you only have 5 degrees of hip extension, every time you run, your body's going to get that motion from somewhere, oftentimes the low back. And so one of the areas I look at if somebody has low back pain with running is, do they have adequate hip extension? If they don't, we're going to mobilize or stretch there. But if they do, we're not just going to stretch in an area where they already have motion. We're going to look at, well, why else could they have pain? So whenever there's, particularly if there's an injury or you're worried about an injury, we want to assess mobility in a nuanced and targeted way. We don't just want to stretch for the sake of stretching. And we can look at, what does your sport require, and do you have that range of motion? So cycling, for example, you need a certain amount of internal rotation of the hip. We need a certain amount of ankle motion, thoracic motion. So we can go joint by joint and see what you need. I will say that more mobility might improve your quality of life, meaning I've met some runners who are super, super stiff and rigid, and they can barely reach down to touch their toes because they've been just shuffling in an ultra running gait pattern for a while. So I'd argue that they might feel better outside of running if they improve their mobility, but whether or not that improves their running performance or decreases their injury risk is kind of a different conversation. And there's actually some evidence that too much stretching or stretching too much right before can actually increase injury risk. So we want to watch out of, always ask, well, why am I stretching? Do I need this? And is this going to help me in a deliberate way? And just keep in mind, we've done quite a few talks on this that you can go back and watch. They should be on our Instagram profile and our Instagram TV channel. But just because you feel tight doesn't mean that your joint has lost mobility. So I know a lot of people who feel crazy tight in their hip flexors, but their hips they're actually hypermobile. They have a ton of motion, and they feel tight either because they have some weakness a muscle imbalance or an injury. And one of those things is causing the muscles to stiffen or tighten up as a protective response. And stretching could actually make it worse. So we want to figure out what's driving it and then mobilize or rehabilitate in a focused way. And a lot of people do get benefits from yoga. I'm not bashing stretching by any means, but it's by no means an elixir of performance or injury prevention like a lot of people think that it might be. So that's a deal on stretching and mobility. Let's move on to foam rolling and massage and jump in with any questions at any time. And again, if you're just on Instagram, you can drop comments in the box there, or you can join the Zoom link in our profile. So foam rolling or massage, we can help with, that can help with feelings of muscle soreness, but it probably doesn't produce long-term change. So all the studies that have done on muscle soreness or self-myofascial release, which is foam rolling, indicates that people do feel better transiently, like within 30 minutes or less. But then after that, they kind of go back to baseline, and it doesn't change how their joints or muscles move in a long-term way. So if you're crazy sore, sure, get on there, roll around a little bit. You'll probably feel better, drive some blood flow. I've found that if people have a hard time firing a certain muscle, that we're doing some brief rolling on that. By brief, I mean less than 2 minutes, and then doing an activation exercise can help a little bit. But again, it's targeted, it's brief. We're not hanging out there for a long time. And then sometimes people can have trigger points. You do a lot of work, and working through there does feel good and can promote some blood flow, some lymphatic flow, which I think could be helpful. But if something is always painful or tight, just like with stretching, we want to ask why. So often trigger points are a response to some type of injury, repetitive movement pattern that's maybe not optimal, or a number of other reasons. So if you always have to hop on the foam roller in the same spot, then we should ask why and get a plan to understand and address that root cause. So again, potentially some benefits from some foam rolling massage, probably transient and more subjective, and just like stretching, probably not an elixir of performance or injury prevention. I just got a question coming in from Instagram that's kind of about cross training. How do I feel about unstructured movement or playtime? And honestly, I love it. I think a lot of people might do better if they didn't follow such a rigid training plan, had some play, had some fun, listen to their body. Fartlek intervals are something that you go hard for a period of time, and then you go easy. And so just kind of going out and playing in the forest, I love that. And so, scheduling some time in the week is great. But if you are training hard for something, you want to make sure that's worked into your kind of volume plan. All right, last one on this one is core strength. So this one, it's hard to say what I hear most, but because we're in a gym, we hear this a ton from our endurance athletes when we say, what do you want in your plan, or what do you want to change about your next plan? They say, I think I need to do some more core strength to feel and perform better. And we're like, maybe, but let's talk about that. So when we think about the core, what do we mean? So we mean the muscles of the torso. So we have the muscles kind of in the front, traditionally considered the abdominals. There's a couple different ones, but we'll just say the front. Then we have the sides, the obliques. And then you have, I think, the muscles on the back and the hips, so the glutes, to be part of the core as well. So what we need these muscles to do is we need them to stabilize the trunk and get us in a good position to breathe with the diaphragm. And we need to be able to express an organized torso under cardiovascular load. So an example, to go back to a runner with back pain, we sometimes see runners who get overextension of their back during running. And so as they fatigue, they come and get this kind of hinge through the low back rather than a more organized kind of neutral position for them. And so that's not bad to extend, but if they're running miles and miles at a time, losing control, and they don't have control over that, then it can cause some problems. So for them, doing some core work to get awareness of the torso, awareness of that anti-extension or working against that extension is potentially helpful. So What the core muscles do not do, however, is they don't generate propulsion and they don't absorb force. So when we think about the majority of running injuries and performance, we need to propel ourselves forward, whether we're swimming, biking, or running, and we need to, at least for running, absorb force. The core muscles don't do that. What does that is the glutes, the hamstrings, the quads, the calves, and if you're a swimmer, the upper body. So those are the muscles that generate and absorb force and create power. And so when we think about performance and injuries, that's where we should be spending the majority of our time in our strength training routine is on that stuff. And we need to train enough core exercises to get some good stabilization of the torso, and more is likely not a great use of our time when we're all pretty busy. So we look at the core in kind of three main planes for endurance athletes. So the first is what we call anti-extension. So that's the example of we want to make sure we're not getting some extension faults at the low back. Then for most of our sports, we got some rotational elements, and we don't want, for running, for example, we don't want the arms to really get this big torso swing. So we do what's called anti-rotation exercises to help stabilize in that torsional plane. An example would be a plank in the top of a push-up position, shoulder tap, where you're removing a base of support and you have to stay still. And then the last one is we call anti-lateral flexion. So we don't want to collapse side to side, and something like a side plank would work there. So if we hit those three categories, and usually we just do 1 or 2 exercises each category a week, that's typically adequate. And doing a whole bunch more sit-ups, crunches, bicycles, other types of core work is probably not a priority. I'm not going to say it's going to cause an injury, but it's just probably not the best use of your time. So that's the deal on core stuff. Any questions there? Cool. All right. And on Instagram, as a reminder, you can just submit questions at any time. I'll try to keep an eye on them. Same for the Zoom. Next one, fact or fiction. Low weight and high reps is the best type of strength training for endurance. Any takers? We got a couple takers for fiction, and I think you guys are catching on. That one is also fiction. We talk about this a lot at Evolve, and so I'm not going to spend all day here, but this is one of my pet peeves, is when runners are afraid to learn how to strength train. And I say learn how because, of course, when you come in the gym, we're not going to put 225 pounds on your back and ask you to do a bunch of squats. We got to work up to heavy weight. But the goal for strength training for endurance athletes, A, you should be doing it, and B, you should have a goal to learn how to do it safely and effectively so you can progressively increase your load and decrease your reps. Why? Well, number one, we don't want to recreate our endurance sport in the gym. To be an effective endurance athlete, you got to do there's nothing that's going to take the place of doing your sport. And so just recreating that sport in the gym, you're probably better off just going to do the sport. So we want to get a different stimulus in the gym. We want actually what we do in the gym to look and feel fairly different than the endurance sport, because we're trying to challenge the body in a different way. So in the gym, we're asking, what adaptation do we want to get from our strength training? So that should be the question. So the adaptations that I look for and that we look for here at Evolve are a couple. So one, some of the most debilitating injuries among endurance athletes are stress fractures and bone stress reactions. They can take a long time to heal. They're incredibly complex and difficult to rehab, so we want to avoid them if we can. And so we need to add load to the system to increase or to change bone density. We also need to do some plyometrics, which are typically lower rep, type of jumping activity. So load and speed help create bone density. And so doing 30, 40 reps and just calling it good at a low weight, that's not going to change how healthy your bones are and your risk of stress fractures. So we got to add some load to do that. So if you had a history of stress fracture in high school or in college, or you're worried about one, you need to be learning how to do some heavy strength training regularly. That should be a priority. Adaptation number 2 is tendon stiffness. So people usually hear that word stiffness and say, I don't want it, muscles are stiff. But we actually want tendons to be stiff. Tendons connect muscle to bone and they transmit energy. And so we want tendons to be a very effective force transmitter. So the stiffer they are, the better they're going to do that, and also the more resilient they're going to be from injuries. They do that better under tempo work. So it's called heavy, slow resistance training. So moving slowly under load helps with tendon health. What does not help with tendon health is doing a lot of reps, because what do you do a lot of reps in? Running, biking, cycling, and swimming. You're already doing a lot of reps there, so we want to do fewer reps, higher load to give it a different stimulus. Now for performance, that's where runners get excited. So you're going to get better performance benefits from some higher load stuff. You're going to have better what's called economy, meaning you can move more efficiently, and any given pace is going to feel easier. Studies have shown you'll have better time to exhaustion. So they do tests where you run until you're exhausted at a certain speed, and people do better after heavy strength training. And you're going to have increased peak power. So let's say you got to charge up a hill, you got to race to a finish line. On a mountain bike, you got to get through a technical bit. You need, there's lots of times, particularly in Flagstaff for our trail athletes, where even during a long race, you want to be able to express your peak power in short bursts. You're going to have better peak power if you train with some higher loads. And this research is clear. So there's very few research that I'm going to say is clear. But when runners misunderstand this, I think it's disappointing, because there are dozens of papers in lots of different sports validating this. And this is what really the athletes at the highest levels who have whole teams around them are doing. And it can be done effectively all the way down to the novice or beginner endurance athlete level. And so you're going to feel better, and you're going to perform better, and you have less injury risk. And it doesn't have to be a lot. 2 or 3 times a week is enough. I will say that you need at least 12 weeks of training to really start to see benefits. So when people just do 6 weeks or 8 weeks, that's not quite enough. So this needs to be a year-round thing. Even in the summer, when people start running or biking more, we still want to get at least 1 to 2 workouts a week, because we need this kind of year-round stimulus to make meaningful change. Doing it in short bursts, you might feel different temporarily, but it's not actually going to change bone, muscle, or tendon. So we're not going to get the adaptations. And so if you're just going to be on again, off again, I get that people are busy, and sticking to routine can be tough, but make a commitment to it, and you're going to see a lot better results. Finally, we're going to dig into this a lot more. I often hear endurance athletes worried about bulking up. We've covered that in depth, so go back on our Instagram TV, but you won't. Science, there's actually an interference effect between endurance training and hypertrophic or mass gaining stimulus, and so it's physiologically very, very challenging. Most endurance athletes don't actually do 12 weeks of consistent training to where they would hypertrophy. And the caloric needs, you need to eat a whole ton. And so there's a ton of reasons why it's very challenging, if not impossible, to bulk up from endurance training. And also the lower reps, less than 10, those aren't the best for hypertrophy or bulking up anyway. When bodybuilders or hypertrophy focused folks typically do 12 to 15 multiple sets. And so high weight doesn't get you big. It's actually volume of endurance, of strength work. So we're going to set that aside, but just know that is a common narrative among endurance athletes that I think is more related to some body image concerns, and there's a whole lot of psychology there. But challenge that if you hear it, or reach out so we can talk on that one further. We got some things coming in the chat. All right. So our next one. So to perform my best, this kind of goes into bulking up. I need to hit a race weight, or I hear people saying they need to drop from their winter weight to their race weight, or something about losing weight to race effectively. And oh man, this sets off lots of red flags. I'm not even going to give you a choice. I'm going to say that this is fiction right off the bat. Because when Abby and I hear this, immediately we have some big concerns. So building a bigger spring and a stronger engine, meaning your muscles and your aerobic base, you're going to have way more benefits there with less risk. So you're going to see a lot of positive changes from improving those things rather than losing weight. So weight loss is a huge risk factor for stress fractures and other injuries. So on almost any medical history form for our athletes, when we're asking about injuries, we ask, have you lost weight? Because if you are, then it's like, well, hey, you're not eating enough and you're probably doing too much. And so if you're losing weight, there's a huge chance that you're going to get injured and that the injury might be fairly significant and take a lot of time to unwind from. Weight loss is also going to be associated with a loss of muscle mass. You can't get around it. There's ways to limit if you're changing your body composition, muscle loss with some strength training, but again, that's focused strength training. But almost every time we see a loss in body mass, we're going to lose muscle mass as well, which is going to decrease your speed and power. And so the net result, you're going to have increased injury risk, and then your performance might be about the same because you've lost some muscle mass. Endurance athletes also need proper nutrition to fuel, recover, and benefit from their workouts. And if they're putting themselves in a caloric deficit to try to get to race weight, then man, they are not going to feel good from their workouts, and they're going to drive themselves potentially into an overtraining state. And again, to go back to strength training, bulking up is, I'm telling you, it's almost impossible. So to get faster, we need to build your engine, which is your aerobic base. So train effectively, which we'll get to in a second. And then build up your muscle strength and power. So to get faster, as Derek, our strength coach, said, runners should work to get faster rather than trying to lose weight. It's like if you had a car and you wanted the car to go faster, it wouldn't really make sense to start taking the doors off, taking the hubcaps off, taking the rear view mirrors off, because that's not going to have a huge effect. And at some point, you're going to remove some essential components that's going to make the car be kind of wonky. So rather, if you want to make the car faster, get a bigger engine, make it more, give it some more horsepower, and that's how you get a car faster rather than removing components. And then also investigate relationships with food and your own body image. I think this is kind of an undercurrent that's not talked about in the endurance training world. It's something that our registered dietitian, Abby, deals with a whole ton. Is that there's a lot of endurance athletes that I think might compensate for some body image or food relationship concerns by just trying to run away from it, literally. And so take some time to investigate your relationship with exercise, with food, with your own body. Reach out to a registered dietitian and potentially, a counselor or a therapist for that. And so Abby, I'm biased, but is an incredible one and works with this type of stuff all the time. And so if you have this need or this thought that you have to look a certain way to perform as an endurance athlete, that's a pause, full stop. Let's investigate that with an RD and a counselor. And just because athletes who you might see on Instagram look a certain way, A, doesn't mean they're healthy, and B, it's probably not how they look that drives how they perform. If they're performing well, it's because they're eating, they're sleeping, and they're training effectively. It's probably not how they look. I will say, because we want to do everything as evidence-based as we can, there's a paper or two out there that says at the highest level, there's an association between some Olympic performers and decreased body mass. So lighter or lower BMI, there's a higher percentage of them on the podiums in some big races. But again, that's an association, not a causation. And if there's any gain at all from changing body mass, it's going to be like probably less than 5%. So unless your paycheck depends on it, I wouldn't even think about changing your weight to change how you perform.
Well,
Have you anything to add there?
Yeah. So I also see this really in those who have off seasons as well. So they're in season, they are quote unquote doing really well with food. Like they're, even just a quote from one of my athletes, like, we're eating salads all the time, we're on it. And then in off season, that's when they're more binging on donuts and things like that. I'm like, well, technically, we should probably flip those things. And then also, when we're looking at, because when you're in season and you have this high volume, at some point, your body baseline needs overall energy. And then we need to look at macros, then we need to look at micros, and then we need to look at other sort of phytonutrients. But it's making sure that we can obtain, first of all, that baseline. And if we start to create this in season, off season from a physiological standpoint, that actually can have some major detriments on our body, and can actually start to cause this weight cycling mechanism, which we have actually found, and there's a lot of research on what weight cycling will do to your body and what can happen and what can be some impacts of weight cycling. And that's basically a lot of chronic and metabolic diseases too. If we were to look at set point theory, which is basically saying that your body has its own little set point of where it likes to be in a weight range within 10 to 15 pounds. If we start to swing too far, that set point can go up, but we can't really bring it back down. So especially if we can just start to maintain overall from just a performance standpoint, so that when you're in off season, you can actually give your body what it needs to recover. But then also when you're in season, making sure that you're, again, not trying to cut or lose, because that's going to be a huge detriment to your overall performance and recovery.
Cool. I'm just going to skip to a slide we had at the end. So on overtraining. So if you are, particularly if you have tried to change your weight in the past, if you're trying to increase your volume, depending on what you're eating, this is something that Abby and I both deal with. So watching out for overtraining. But we typically see it most in athletes who have been trying to change their weight while training. We're going through some of those cycling. And so signs of that are, signs of overtraining would be depression or anxiety or irritability. So changes in your mental health without any other, instigating cause. Overuse injuries. So if I see anybody who has more than 2 overuse injuries in a year, I try to immediately refer them over to Abby, because there's something going on beyond just their biomechanical factors. So if you're doing too much and not eating enough, you're going to run into an injury eventually. For females, altered menstrual function, typically missing some menstrual cycles. And if you ever had a history of that, so this is unfortunately still too common in our high school and collegiate athletes. And so if you had a history of that, you might be at a greater risk for overtraining later in life. And that's also, by the way, going to change your bone density. And so if you had a history of that, you really need to start strength training and do it consistently. Abby.
Another thing on that too is, so we always think of this, a lot of these things are now referred to as RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which we used to call the female athlete triad. And that's why it got changed to RED-S, because it was leaving out obviously 50% of the athletic population, which is the males. And so we see this very obvious symptom of altered menstrual function or a total pause in menstrual function in female athletes. Unfortunately, males don't have that same indicator, but the same hormonal functions are happening as well. So if there are men who are still in this under fueling, overtraining situation, unfortunately, we don't have any signs before you get a stress fracture or before you get an overuse injury to actually identify, oh, hey, something's wrong. But a lot of the same hormonal, especially testosterone, that's one of the main bone hardening and bone building hormones in male and female bodies, but definitely in men, is when you're in that deficit state, you'll see those same types of things happening, but unfortunately we can't catch it early enough. So therefore it's too late until there's already some sort of major injury.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So yeah, definitely watch out for that, male or female. I'm just showing on Instagram, so Instagram can see this list. I'm not going to read every one, but basically, if you start feeling off and you're burning the candle at both ends, you might want to think of dialing things back. Make sure you're eating enough, talking to some professionals to watch out, because if you drive yourself into a true kind of RED-S or overtrained state, man, that can take months to a year, 2 years, depending on your commitment to coming out of it. But we were athletes that are in that state for a long, long time, and so we want to get ahead of that if we can. Some other ones I'm just going to pick through this list that you might not realize: decreased coordination. So if I see an athlete who has never sprained their ankle and they get like a couple in a month, then like, hey, they might be doing too much because their body can no longer coordinate their neuromuscular control. Frequent colds or sinus issues, or some people, I get cold sores, altered resting heart rate, fatigue, GI issues, sleep malfunction. So any of that type of stuff can is red flags to watch out for overtraining.
One more thing on heart rate real quick too. So often in athletes, athletes will generally have a low resting heart rate, somewhere even in the upper 40s or even sometimes the low 50s. And that's always been told to athletes, oh, it's because you're an athlete, which can be true. But the main thing we really want to look at, especially if you're overtrained, is that jump from when you're resting to then maybe when you first stand up, or even if you're doing something very, very low, which should be like low volume or low tempo, that should be really easy. Like if it's a recovery run and you're not really breathing that hard, but for some reason your heart rate is shooting through the roof, like hitting 180s or 190s, then that's a really good indication that you are overtraining and you're pushing too far.
Yeah, so that's we're going to talk about intensity and volume in a second, but I do recommend that most endurance athletes have a heart rate monitor because it can be incredibly insightful into your load. So yeah, watching that, not just resting, but when you're moving to or changing positions. And then also your body, just knows stress. It doesn't know running stress versus work stress versus COVID-19 stress. And so psychological stress can add to this load too. It's not going to be a load on the body as much, but if you, let's say you work night shift and you're at the hospital and you're an endurance athlete, you work on your feet all day, you're not sleeping enough because you have a newborn, any number of things, you're homeschooling your kids now. All of that can take a training load that might have been fine at one point and now make it not fine. And so having some things to look in to see how am I feeling rather than just persisting into that can be very helpful. And heart rate is one, or heart rate variability. That's a whole lecture that we'll do at some point. But there's so many wearable devices that can give us some things to say, hey, I'm not feeling great right now. And listening to those. I've worked with an athlete who had 2 stress fractures, sacral stress fractures. And I said, do you use any of these tools to monitor how you're feeling? And he said, no, I like to just feel it out and let my body tell me. And I was like, well, I don't trust how your body tells you because you ran yourself into 2 fractures. And so using some tools, I'm all for getting that intuitive feel, but endurance athletes sometimes are so focused that it's helpful to have something external to help them know how to feel. Okay, we're going to move back to, that's race weight. More volume and intensity is always better for an athlete. So we hear this a lot in Flagstaff because we are like the hub for ultra running. And so we see some athletes who run anywhere else in the country what would be considered crazy volume, and they're always trying to do hard workouts, and we love to help people execute on that. But the narrative that just doing more and doing harder, that's one that we hear a lot, and I think you guys are catching on to me. It's this one's fiction again. And so when we write a training plan, we want to start with some certain parameters. I'm just going to spin Instagram around again and just kind of hold this so you can see this slide because there's some good stuff on here. And on Instagram, you can join the Zoom link in our bio. But we want to look at a couple different things. There's a few variables or levers that we're going to look at when we put together a training plan. So one is intensity. So how hard are we going at different workouts throughout the week? The second one is overall weekly and monthly volume. So what is our volume in a given week? And how are we progressing that volume over the course of a month or a whole training plan, which could be 2 to 4 months usually. And then how are we progressing? Usually runners have, I say runners, please know that this is standard for almost any endurance athlete. Runners are probably just the ones we work with the most, runners and triathletes. But there's usually one long outing a week at least. So how do we progress that week to week? And then how do we build up? So how do we organize a week and then a month? And so the guidelines that we look at are a couple things, and these are all evidence-based. And I've encouraged you, if you hear things that contradict what we're saying, um, shoot us a note, let us know, because we try to base everything off of when it's available, peer-reviewed evidence, so real science, and then if that's unavailable, our best clinical experience and knowledge of other coaches too. So I'll let you know where there's good evidence and where we're making our best clinical judgment. So what there is good evidence for is doing only 10 to 20% of your volume per week at a high intensity. So that means you're not going hard very often. So we want to, usually for most people, that's 1 day a week where they're truly going hard. And on their other days, they're going easy. And by easy, I mean easier than you probably think. So this is classically known as zone 2 training, 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. Google a formula, there's lots of them out there. It takes 60 to 70% of that. Or if you have a wearable, check to see, like during a hard workout, what your highest was. I also like it's called the 180 formula from a kind of a well-known coach called Phil Maffetone. Or if you don't have anything, just an intensity that allows you to breathe in and out through your nose where you're not using your mouth. That's usually a good limiter on intensity. So what I find, particularly for people who work full-time and are trying to fit workouts in around work, they want their workouts to feel productive, meaning that they go kind of hard. But I find they get caught in this uncomfortable middle zone where they're not going hard, meaning they're not doing sprint work, true top end speed, maximum effort work, but they're not doing easy work. So their heart rate might be at, say, 160 for 5 miles. So they're breathing hard the whole time. They've never gotten to a sprint, but they're never down low. So they're right on this kind of threshold. So that's closer to a tempo or a race pace. We need that for racing, but the research is clear that this polarized training, meaning a little bit hard, and then a whole lot easy, tends to get better results, even if your race is in that middle zone. And so that's where the contradiction is, where people get mixed up. Even if your race is in that uncomfortable middle because it's a half marathon maybe, or a 10K, or even for our higher end athletes, a marathon might be at that uncomfortable middle. Even for athletes at that pace, going hard and going easy and not doing a whole lot of work in the middle, they recover better and they perform better. So that one is pretty evidence-based. So that's one of the biggest mistakes I see from athletes, is doing too much in that uncomfortable middle. So that's one that we look at. The second, and by the way, if you want to practice your race pace, do 1 to 2 a month at most. So let's say once a month, you're going to do a workout that's going to be a hard race pace, longer distance. That's okay, but you got to plan some recovery around that. We'll often do that in our plans. Sorry, we're back on Instagram. And then, do not disturb that, sorry. Okay, and then we want to progress our volume. Back of the napkin, easy calculation is 10 to 20% a week. And the 10% rule, that's been around forever. Because I am maybe a little bit of a nerd and I like spreadsheets, I use a little more math when I put mine together, and I calculate something called the acute to chronic workload ratio. If you search our websites on our articles, we have an article about this. There's also some good ones online, but basically you want to your chronic workload ratio, that's like how prepared are you to train. If you've been training for 1 week, you don't have a big base. If you've been training for a year, you got a huge base. So your acute workload is, what are you planning this week? And what you're planning this week shouldn't be a whole lot more than what your base is. And so we typically look at a 1 month or 2 month period, and we use some formulas to calculate that. So I'm not going to go into it because most people, they start to lose me if I get into math too much. But if you're interested, reach out and I can shoot you some spreadsheets, or there's some great resources if you just Google that term, acute to chronic workload ratio. But the takeaway is we want to progress a little bit at a time. Typically when I see injuries, it's when I see big spikes in volume. Somebody starts, gets excited about training, and then their volume goes through the roof. Or maybe the weather's not great and they take 3 weeks off, or they go on vacation and they haven't run it all in a month, and then they get back to right where they were the month prior. Or I've seen it now in COVID where people weren't running. It was the winter, and now they can't go to a gym and they're running every day. And so it's those type of spikes, which so try not to let your enthusiasm get ahead of you. Just be patient. And then throughout the month, particularly if you have a history of stress fractures, we typically want to program 1 week with what we call a deload. You're not doing nothing, but you might have 50% reduced volume. You might not do your hard day that week. You're going to have a week that's deliberately easier. The reason we do that is because bone, tendon, and I would argue our sympathetic nervous system, so our stress system, given how there's a lot of stress around us, those take longer to recover than our muscles and our cardiovascular system. And so you might feel like you're ready to go, but your bones and tendons are saying, hey, I need a little longer. And so when we look at the metabolism of bone, how bone works, there's kind of a 2 or 3 week window that bone is remodeling. It's all dynamic. The body is dynamic. It's always adapting and changing. And so we got to give it some time to catch up now and then. And then how long or how much volume should you do? And so I typically want people to work up to, I tend to be fairly reasonable especially for my, people who are not professionals. We can get away with some moderate volume programs. You don't have to do crazy high volume to be prepared for a race. So typically I want to build up to a long run that's between 60 to 80% of your race distance. That's a big range. So typically for shorter races, we're going to be closer to that 80%. So like a 10K or a half marathon, 80%, for a half marathon, 80% is about 10, 11 miles. For a full marathon, we might only be doing 20 to 24 miles, so we're closer to about 70%. So for our ultra guys, a 50 mile, 100 mile, then kind of all bets are off and it's individual. Same thing if you got a 5K, that's a lot shorter. And so we might be closer to doing 100% of that before we race. So at the extremes, super long, super short, those ratios aren't going to hold up, but typically that's a good place to start. And then if you have a couple seasons under your belt with no injuries, then we can start to add a little bit more volume. There's some research that, with more volume, we will get more performance. But I never want that to be at the expense of health. So I don't want to overtrain you at the expense of injuries, because you're not going to perform if you're injured. And so that's a very nuanced conversation. And I'm only going to increase your volume if we've proven that you're doing all the right things. You're strength training, you're eating, you're sleeping, you're recovering well, you don't have injuries. Then we're going to give the green light to do a little more volume. So each week, to fit this all together, generally I do a short, easy run, typically at the beginning of the week to get, you still might be sore from your weekend effort. Short, easy day, 3-4 miles if you're a runner. If you're a cyclist, maybe it's only 30 minutes. Then we're going to do a speed or a tempo work. So that's our hard day. So we might do, if you're a runner, some quarter mile, half mile, or even mile repeats, where you're going, 80 to 100% intensity, but then you're resting and repeating. Same thing, you're going to do some intervals on the bike or some blocks in the pool. You're going to recover from that. You're going to do a medium distance. So, if you're a runner, that might be, 30 to 40% of your race distance at an easy pace. And then you're going to do your long day. And I think for almost any distance, we can get away with 4 training days, unless you're long, like full Ironman, 50, 100-mile race. Then we might need to have 5 days of training. But for a lot of athletes, I try to get them to just do 3 or 4 days of their endurance sport, so we have room for the strength training, and so their body has time to recover. So that's kind of the spiel on how we look at intensity, volume, and progression. If this slide alone and eating and sleeping would probably prevent, hard to say, but 80% of running injuries if people had intensity, volume progression, and their nutrition and sleep dialed in. So this is really important if you're writing your own training program. And if you don't know where to start, we can help. So reach out, because we can help you put together an appropriate training program. And actually, in a week or two, we're going to have some training programs out on our site for a 10K, a half marathon, a marathon, and I believe a 50K distance. We're going to have 4 running running distances that fit these guidelines, and they're going to have some strength training plans associated with them. So stay tuned. All right, our last one, and then we have an open Q&A. This one I'm going to mainly pitch over to our registered dietitian, Abby, but we've been hearing it a whole lot in the past year or two, since there's been some hype around the Game Changers movie, some books about plant-based diets. There are some big name endurance athletes who are vegan or vegetarian. So the myth, or the thing we're going to talk about, is that a vegetarian or a vegan diet is the best for performance. Fact or fiction? Coach Moach, what do you think?
Fiction.
Fiction again. Instagram. If you're on Instagram and you can't hear Abby, just jump over to the Zoom. I'm going to turn the camera around so you can at least see Abby and the slide. But I'm going to kick it over to Abby and let her talk through what we're thinking about plant-based diets.
Yeah, so I think with Game Changers, there's obviously a lot of hype around it. With any sort of documentary, there's always a lot of bias in one way or the other, whichever way they're leaning. So I think that's always one thing to think about, and think about what someone is selling you. Granted, but I think the really important thing to remember is that there's no one specific diet for anyone. Until we can totally get your genetic code and understand every single step, we're not actually going to know what you are fueled best on and what satiates you the most and what feels good. So the things that are going to be best for you are going to be the things that bring you enough energy, B, enough balance of those macronutrients, because again, we need to make sure that you are meeting that at least baseline. And then also, we need to be really, really aware of what's also going to keep you full and what also keeps you feeling good and good as a human. So I think that with all of this hype, the thing to remember is that with endurance sports, especially if you're pushing volumes of 40, 50 plus miles a week, even if it's quote unquote just 30, which is still a lot. If you're pushing a lot of volume like that, we also need to remember that you are basically burning through energy at a high rate, which means that anytime you're burning through the energy, you're also breaking down more tissue, especially those higher volume places that you get into, and you have a smaller window for recovery. So I think one of the benefits of a more plant-based diet is that they're generally higher in carbs, which is fantastic for an endurance athlete. But we also just need to make sure that if you are eating a more omnivorous diet, that you have enough carbs. The main drawback of a plant-based diet is that unfortunately, it's really hard to obtain adequate amounts of protein, which is here below in the slide. It's about 1.5 to 2 grams. Sometimes there's even more. There's some new research coming out that it's even more, upwards of 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So for, a general person, that's a ton of protein. That's 120 grams to possibly 150. It depends on, again, how much you weigh. And that's a lot to do. And we can only really absorb about 30 grams of protein in about a 2-hour window. And that's even generous. And if we're looking at plant-based diets, the quality of the protein, so the bioavailability of those proteins, is actually less than, unless you're eating soy, which is actually soy and eggs are perfect on the scale of proteins and bioavailability. But if you're feeling mostly off beans and legumes, you're not going to be able to absorb all of that. So you're going to have to be eating like it's your full-time job, basically. So it's not necessarily bad. I would recommend, if you're an endurance athlete and pushing those high volumes, that again, you need to A, first eat like it's your job, B, probably supplement with a multivitamin. Definitely something to either talk to me if you have questions about, or a doctor if you have a sports medicine doctor, which we really don't have in town, who actually understands what you do. There's also going to be some other key nutrients that a lot of your B vitamins that you could be blowing through really quickly at a higher rate, whether you're omnivorous or not. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Um, and there's no real research that supports that one is better than the other. Because again, first of all, we need to meet this baseline of overall energy, and then macros, and then micros, and then phytonutrients and things like that. So I think that it's really trendy and really sexy right now to be a vegan trail runner and like a no meat athlete. And you can definitely do it really well. But there's definitely possibly some drawbacks to it as well too.
Yeah, cool. And I would say there's also no research that supports all of the purported performance benefits. There's nothing to say it's better or worse, but there's nothing to show that it's definitely better. There's high performing athletes on all types of diets, but typically those athletes are one that have at least a dietitian, if not a team of dietitians and chefs around them. I've worked with the dietitian and for some Tour de France teams, and they travel with a dietitian and a chef when they go to the Tour de France. And so, if anybody has any food concerns, they are in the hands of experts who know what they're eating and know how to make it taste good and digestible. And so, trying to do this on your own, particularly if you have a full-time job, is going to be hard, and probably require some supplementation, things like that.
And if you don't, if you have a full-time job, possibly have a family, really don't know a ton about nutrition, even if you think you do, you probably don't know all the ins and outs of it. And then if you don't like to cook, probably not the way to go. We can probably start to really optimize if your first and foremost concern is to perform well and recover well, then we should probably start to look at some other things as well. And I think, yeah, what Brian mentioned with any sort of high, even like a lot of collegiate athletes now have dietitians where they're actually looking at how do we manage this? How do we make sure you're actually getting enough? So I think that's important if you are pushing those higher volumes. It's not enough to just eat 3 meals a day and maybe a snack. You have to be consuming a lot more than that.
And I think, I don't want to get in a whole conversation about food allergies, sensitivities, but if you have anything that you're unable to eat due to an allergy, then removing that on top of removing any animal-based products, all of a sudden the list of things you're allowed to eat is very, very small. And so when you're trying to, fuel yourself, then your options are limited. And yeah.
And I think even building upon that too is that if we run into Brian mentioned if you're on Instagram Live, you can't see it anymore, but a lot of those signs of overtraining, one of them is definitely gastrointestinal dysfunction. So whether that's slowed down digestion, whether that's bloating, there's a lot of different things. And so if you were to go to a normal doctor or even a naturopath or someone who doesn't understand athletes, what they're going to do is their first inclination might be to eliminate things. And then what actually happens is that we can start to dig ourselves in a deeper hole because, again, we have less overall energy. We have a smaller menu overall that we can choose from. And I actually have a few athletes that I've worked with in the past that have been so limited in what they can tolerate that once we can actually feed them food again, then the more they tolerate a diverse amount of food. So it's actually the opposite of eliminating is really the ideal thing that we can do for our gastrointestinal systems.
Cool. So I am sure in the coming weeks or months we'll do a whole hour on because we've done it before, and bears repeating a whole hour on nutrition for endurance athletes. But I think that's kind of all we got. So the overtraining signs are there. So to finish, just some priorities for endurance athletes. Is try to simplify, ignore a lot of the nonsense that gets marketed to you on Instagram and in some of the communities. Try to look to real science, and it's okay to keep things simple. So proper intensity, volume, deloading, and progression is really a big key. Doing some heavy, slow resistance training 2 to 3 times a week. Doing some appropriate mobility and core recruitment, and then not worrying about it, because once you have enough is enough. Plenty of sleep, some well-rounded and sufficient nutrition. don't pursue weight loss and, 1 to 2 complete rest days a week. Do those things and you're going to perform better. You're probably going to have lower risk of injury. And hopefully you can just set aside a lot of the pop culture, fad diety, things like that. And Abby just put in, make sure you're still having fun, because that's why we should get into this stuff in the first place, is because we enjoy it. It's healthy for us. And especially if you're not a pro athlete and your paycheck doesn't depend on your sport, then man, why are you going to compromise your health for it? And so you should really approach things in a well-rounded way. If you're not a pro athlete, which even if you want to be, most of us, to be honest, are not. We do have the luxury of working with a few, but they approach it in very much this way too, because their health depends on it. And so don't compromise your health for your sport. And if you need help, we're here for you. Shoot us a message. Reach out via email, whatever you need to do. We would love to get involved in the conversation and point you in the right direction. Abby, anything else to add?
No, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for watching. We got some time. If Aaron or Princess, if you guys got any questions.
Yeah. Do you have any specific resistance training exercises you recommend?
A whole ton, man. That's a whole list of things. So starting hopefully by next week, we will have some programs out on our site that we actually have a home training kit that doesn't take really any space to do some resistance training with. We're gonna have videos for everything. So we'll have some integrated programs coming out soon. At a high level, the things I look for is we want to have good hip muscle function, so glute exercises. I like usually some side steps with a band, and then to warm up. And then we're progressing things we think in big movement patterns, so squats, lunges, deadlifts, some calf work. And then the core stuff were those patterns that I talked about. So we tend to keep things pretty simple for our runners, and just thinking some big movement patterns where we're trying to get technique down and then load the system up. So anyway, that's I could go on for a whole lot. So I apologize that wasn't too specific. But if you have any questions about programs, you can drop me an email, or if you drop your email in the chat box, if you want, I can, or it'll be on our Instagram if you follow us. Some programs, and we're going to try to make them fairly affordable because we know that COVID is hitting some people hard. So those will be coming out hopefully next week. Great. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks for joining, Aaron. Princess, we miss you too. Yeah, hope you guys are staying healthy and safe. Next week, Abby, do we have a topic for next week yet?
Not yet. What do you want to learn?
We'll come up with something. But we're doing these every week. We'll typically announce the topic a day or two before on our Instagram. And so, Aaron, we'd love to see you back. And of course, Princess, we love seeing you. Stay healthy as well. Have a great night, everybody. And we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, guys. Bye, Aaron. Thanks for